The stench of blood and sweat filled every corner of the underground fighting pits. Neil Reeves pressed his back against the cold metal bars of his cage, watching another execution disguised as entertainment. A creature with 6 limbs and purple skin collapsed in the center ring, its body twitching as the crowd of Draval spectators roared their approval. The victor, a massive reptilian warrior covered in natural armor plates, raised all 4 arms in triumph. Neil counted 12 days since his capture, 12 days since the Draval warship had ambushed his exploration vessel near the outer territories. His crew was dead. His ship was debris. He was property now, hauled across 3 star systems in chains to this gambling station called Helix 7. The Draval were giants compared to humans. Most stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick gray skin that could deflect small arms fire. They had evolved as apex predators on a harsh world, and their empire reflected that brutality. Conquered species filled their stations, serving as slaves, laborers, and when the mood struck, entertainment. A guard banged his weapon against Neil's cage. "Move, tiny thing. Tournament master wants to see all new stock." Neil stood slowly, his muscles stiff from confinement. The guard towered over him, sneering at his 5'10" frame. To the Draval, humans looked fragile. Soft pink skin, no claws, no armor, no visible weapons. Just another weak species that had wandered too far from home. They marched Neil and 15 other captives through winding corridors. The other prisoners came from species Neil had never seen before. Some had fur, others scales. A few possessed extra limbs or eyes. All wore the same expression of hopeless defeat. Station Helix 7 sat in neutral space beyond the reach of any single government. Here the Draval did whatever they pleased. The procession entered a vast chamber where Tournament Master Gresh waited on an elevated platform. The Draval official was ancient by their standards, his gray skin marked with ritual scars from 1,000 fights. He examined each prisoner with cold calculation, sorting them into categories with quick gestures. That one to the veteran pits, those 3 to the training yards. That one is already broken, send it to the labor camps. Gresh's voice echoed through the chamber. When the guards shoved Neil forward, Gresh paused. He leaned down, studying the human with obvious confusion. "What is this? Did someone's pet escape?" The guards laughed. One of them kicked Neil's leg. "New species, Tournament Master. Calls itself human. Found wandering in Sector 7. Gresh circled Neil like a buyer inspecting defective merchandise. No claws, skin tears easily. Muscle structure is pathetic. Bones would snap under a real warrior's grip. He straightened up, waving dismissively. This thing would die in the first exchange. Not even worth the betting pool. Relief flickered through Neil's chest. If they thought he was useless, maybe they would send him somewhere other than the death pits. Anywhere had to be better than the arena. Wait, a new voice cut through the chamber. "I will take this one." A female Draval descended from the observation gallery. She wore elaborate robes marked with noble house symbols. Her skin had a slightly blue tint that Neil had learned indicated high status among their kind. 2 armed escorts flanked her. Gresh bowed slightly. "Lady Orva, surely you do not want this creature. It cannot even fight properly." Lady Orva approached Neil, tilting his chin up with one massive finger. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, but her eyes held the cold amusement of someone examining an insect. "Exactly why I want it. My collection needs something more exotic. This human will make an interesting conversation piece." "It might die just from living in your estate," Gresh warned. "These soft species are delicate. Then I will be only slightly disappointed." Lady Orva produced a data pad and transferred credits. "Have it cleaned and delivered to my transport. And do try to be careful with it. I hate damaged goods." The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Neil went from potential arena fighter to purchase property without any say in the matter. Guards dragged him to a processing station where they stripped away his torn uniform and fitted him with a plain gray garment. A medical scanner ran over his body, cataloging his biological data. Then they locked a metal collar around his neck, the device humming with active tracking technology. The transport ship to Lady Orva's estate took 6 hours. Neil shared a cargo hold with 3 other newly purchased creatures. None of them spoke a language he understood, but fear needed no translation. They huddled in their respective corners, avoiding eye contact. When the ship docked, servants herded them through pristine corridors into a massive private zoo. Transparent enclosures lined the walls, each containing a different species from across the galaxy. Some paced nervously. Others lay motionless, their eyes blank with despair. A few had clearly given up on survival entirely. A servant, itself a conquered species marked with servitude brands, led Neil to his assigned enclosure. The space was actually comfortable by prison standards. A sleeping platform, basic sanitation, even some entertainment screens, but the walls were reinforced transparent steel, and the door had no handle on the inside. "Lady Orva will visit when she pleases," the servant said in broken standard language. "You will display yourself appropriately. You will not attempt escape. Compliance means comfort. Resistance means pain." The servant pointed at Neil's collar. "That device can deliver shocks or poison. Your choice matters very little here." The door sealed shut. Neil sat on the sleeping platform and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his situation. He was thousands of light years from Earth. No one knew where he was. His captors saw him as a curiosity, barely more intelligent than an animal. The rational part of his mind understood that being Orva's pet was better than dying in the arena, but another part of him, the part that had survived 3 tours in Earth's Unity Wars, began taking notes. He studied the lock mechanisms, memorized guard patrol patterns, observed how the Draval moved and fought during their own training sessions in the estate's private gymnasium. If these aliens wanted a pet, Neil would play that role. He would be small and harmless and forgettable, and while they laughed at the tiny human in the pretty cage, he would learn everything he could about how to hurt them. Patience had won wars before. It would win his freedom too. 3 months of captivity taught Neil more about the Draval than years of diplomatic contact ever could. Every morning, servants arrived to clean the enclosures and deliver food. The meals were nutritionally adequate but flavorless, calculated to keep specimens alive without providing anything resembling comfort. Neil ate everything they gave him and asked for nothing extra. Lady Orva visited her collection twice per week, usually bringing guests. She would parade them past the various enclosures, pointing out rare specimens and explaining where she had acquired each one. When visitors paused at Neil's cage, she would tap on the glass like he was a fish in an aquarium. "This is a human," she would say, "from a newly discovered world called Earth. Notice the complete lack of natural defenses. They have no claws, no armor, not even protective fur. Their planet must be remarkably gentle to produce such soft creatures." The guests would laugh and take pictures. Some would make jokes about keeping humans as children's toys. Neil would sit quietly and smile, playing the harmless pet exactly as expected. Inside, he cataloged every detail about his captors. The Draval were strong but inflexible. Their military training emphasized overwhelming force over tactical thinking. They charged straight ahead because their natural armor let them ignore most counterattacks. Their height and reach meant they rarely faced opponents who could exploit their high center of gravity. In their culture, retreat or evasion was seen as cowardice rather than strategy. Neil also learned their language through the entertainment screens. The Draval loved broadcasting their arena fights across their empire. He watched hundreds of hours of combat footage, studying how different species fought and failed. Most alien warriors tried to match Draval strength with strength, a battle they inevitably lost. The few who showed creativity or tactical thinking still fell because they lacked the endurance for extended combat. In the enclosure, beside Neil's, lived a small alien, named Pip. The creature stood only 3 feet tall, covered in soft blue fur with large eyes designed for low-light environments. Pip's species were traders and explorers, utterly non-violent by nature. The Draval had captured Pip's entire merchant vessel and distributed the crew across various collections. "You watch the fights too much," Pip said one evening through the shared wall. Their translator collar made communication possible. "It will only make you sad. No pet species ever wins. We are not built for their kind of violence." Neil continued his exercises, push-ups and squats and core work in the limited space. "I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to understand." "Understand what?" "How they will kill you if you anger them." Pip's ears drooped. "I had a mate. 3 younglings. The Draval separated us at processing. I do not even know if they still live. Understanding changes nothing." "Understanding changes everything," Neil said, moving into a handstand against the wall. "The Draval think they're apex predators. But real predators adapt to their prey. They only know one way to fight because nothing has ever forced them to learn another way." Pip watched Neil's exercise routine with confusion. "Your body is so weak compared to theirs. What good is training?" Humans aren't strong like Draval or fast like some species, but we can run longer than almost anything on our world. We can survive injuries that would kill other animals. And we're really, really good at pattern recognition. Neil dropped back to his feet. Every fighting style has weaknesses. I just need to find theirs. The months passed slowly. Neil maintained his exercise routine and continued learning. He discovered that Draval joints, despite their armored exterior, were vulnerable at specific angles. Their respiratory system required them to pause and breathe deeply after extended exertion, a biological necessity they tried to hide. Their eyes, positioned for binocular predator vision, had significant blind spots to the sides. Other prisoners in Orva's collection noticed Neil's activities, but most dismissed them as pointless. A few, like Pip, started doing basic exercises themselves just to pass the time. Neil shared what he learned about Draval physiology, framing it as interesting observations rather than tactical intelligence. Lady Orva held a party in her estate 6 months after Neil's arrival. Wealthy Draval from across the system attended, celebrating some military victory in distant space. Servants opened the enclosures and herded the collection into a larger display room, where guests could interact more directly with the exotic specimens. Neil stood among the other captives, all of them chained to prevent any escape attempt. The Draval nobles circulated through the room, poking at prisoners, making them perform tricks, laughing at their discomfort. One drunk noble grabbed a reptilian prisoner and tried to ride it like an animal. Another forced a furred creature to sing songs from its homeworld. When several Draval approached Neil, he kept his expression neutral. They made him stand on a platform to show his height compared to theirs. They examined his hands, fascinated by the lack of claws. One noble squeezed Neil's arm and laughed at the soft muscle. "This thing could not hurt a juvenile," the noble declared. "Orva, where did you find something so pathetically weak?" Lady Orva, several drinks into the evening, waved dismissively. "It amuses me. Sometimes weakness is its own entertainment." The drunk noble, whose name was Bront, had a reputation as a mid-level arena fighter. He won matches against other species, but never rose high enough to face true Draval champions. His massive frame swayed as he studied Neil with bloodshot eyes. "I have an idea," Bront announced. "Let us see if the tiny human can fight. Just a friendly match. No weapons, no armor. I will barely touch it." He turned to the crowd. "Who wants to see the human try to fight?" The other nobles cheered enthusiastically. Lady Orva hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. But carefully, Bront. I paid good money for that specimen." Servants cleared a space in the center of the room. They removed Neil's chains and pushed him into the makeshift ring. Bront stepped in opposite him, rolling his massive shoulders. The noble stood nearly 9 feet tall, his arms as thick as Neil's torso. His natural armor plates gleamed under the estate lighting. "Try to hit me, little human," Bront said, spreading his arms wide. "I will not even dodge." Neil looked at the crowd of laughing nobles. He looked at Pip and the other prisoners watching with terrified expressions. He looked at Lady Orva, confident that her pet would provide amusing entertainment before inevitably cowering in fear. Then Neil looked at Bront and saw every vulnerability he had spent 6 months memorizing. The high center of gravity, the stiff knee joints, the exposed throat between armor plates, the overconfidence of a fighter who had never faced a truly desperate opponent. Neil took a slow breath and centered his weight. "Okay," he said quietly. "If you insist." Bront laughed and took a step forward, reaching down to grab the human like a toy. Neil moved. 6 months of observation and training compressed into 3 seconds of violence. Neil ducked under the grasping arm and drove his fist into Bront's knee joint at precisely the angle he had calculated. The noble's leg buckled. As Bront fell forward, Neil caught the massive arm and used the alien's own momentum to twist it behind his back. The shoulder joint popped with a wet sound. Bront roared in pain and tried to rise, but Neil was already moving to the next target. He drove his heel into the back of Bront's other knee, then grabbed the noble's head and slammed it face first into the floor. The impact cracked 2 of Bront's front teeth. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds. Bront lay on the ground, groaning and bleeding, while Neil stood over him, breathing steadily. The room had gone completely silent. Lady Orva stared at her pet human with an expression of pure shock. The other nobles looked between Bront's collapsed form and the small creature that had put him there. Several started backing away instinctively. Neil met Lady Orva's eyes and spoke in perfect Draval, his accent flawless from months of study. "You wanted to see if I could fight," Now you know. The room exploded with shouting. Guards surrounded Neil within seconds, their weapons pointed at his chest. He raised his hand slowly, offering no resistance. The smart move was to submit now and figure out his next step later. Fighting his way out of an estate full of armed Draval was suicide, and Neil had no interest in dying just to make a point. Lady Orva's face had gone from shock to rage. She shoved through the crowd of nobles, staring down at Bront, who was still groaning on the floor. Two servants rushed forward to help the injured fighter, struggling to lift his massive frame. Blood dripped from his mouth where his teeth had cracked against the polished stone. "You," Orva said, pointing at Neil with a shaking finger. "You damaged my guest. You have embarrassed me in my own home." Neil kept his hands raised. "He challenged me to fight. I fought. Should I have lost on purpose?" The question caught Orva off guard. Several nobles muttered among themselves, some nodding reluctantly. In Draval culture, refusing a direct challenge was shameful. Bront had offered combat and suffered the consequences. The fact that a supposedly weak pet had delivered those consequences was humiliating, but technically, Neil had only done what was demanded of him. Bront finally managed to stand with the servant's help. His face was swollen and his arm hung at an odd angle. "I will kill you for this, human," he spat through broken teeth. "I will tear you apart slowly." "You had your chance," Neil replied calmly. "Maybe practice more before the next challenge." The nobles erupted into arguments. Some demanded Neil be executed immediately for injuring a Draval. Others, intrigued by the upset, wanted to see more. A few had already started calculating betting odds. Lady Orva stood in the center of the chaos, her investment suddenly looking very different than the harmless pet she had intended. An older noble named Gresh, the same tournament master who had first processed Neil, pushed through the crowd. He examined Bront's injuries with professional interest, then turned to study Neil. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "My world has conflict," Neil said simply. "We adapt or die," Gresh nodded slowly. "Lady Orva, I believe you have made an interesting purchase. This human is no pet. It is a warrior hiding in soft flesh." He turned to address the crowd. "I propose a solution to this situation. The human has proven combat capability. Let it fight officially in the arena. If it wins, Lady Orva profits from the betting. If it dies, her embarrassment dies with it." Orva considered the suggestion. Her initial anger faded as she calculated potential gains. "The betting pools would be significant," she said slowly. "No one has seen a human fight before. The odds would heavily favor any Draval opponent." "Exactly," Gresh said. "And if it somehow won a few matches, the odds would shift, allowing for even greater profits." He smiled coldly. "Though I suspect it will die quickly." Bront was drunk and careless. A sober arena fighter would crush this creature. The other nobles liked this idea. It salvaged entertainment from the evening's disaster and promised future profits. Orva's expression shifted from rage to calculation. She looked at Neil with new eyes, seeing money instead of a damaged toy. "Very well," she announced. "The human will fight in tomorrow's arena matches. I will wager everything I paid for it against its survival. If it dies, at least I recover my losses." Guards dragged Neil back to his enclosure, but they handled him more carefully now. Word had spread through the servant class about what happened at the party. Even the other prisoners looked at him differently. Pip pressed against their shared wall, speaking urgently through the barrier. "What have you done?" Pip's voice trembled. "They will put you against real fighters. Arena veterans who have killed hundreds. You cannot win." Neil sat on his sleeping platform, assessing the damage to his hands. His knuckles were bruised from the impact with Bront's armored skin. "I know the arena fighters. I have watched them for months. They are good at what they do, but they all fight the same way. One way or 1,000 ways, what difference does it make? You are still human, still small and soft." Pip's large eyes were wet with tears. "I have seen every species try to fight the Draval. They always lose. Then I will be the first to win." Neil flexed his fingers, working through the stiffness. "Or I will die. Either way, I am done being a pet." The night passed slowly. Neil meditated and stretched, preparing his body for what was coming. He had fought before, in Earth's wars between corporate factions and nationalist states. He had seen friends die and killed enemies himself. Combat was not new to him, but those battles involved weapons and tactics and support from his unit. Tomorrow he would be alone in a ring with nothing but his body and his mind. Morning arrived with the sound of transport engines. Guards loaded Neil onto a vehicle along with several other scheduled fighters. The other aliens were all larger species, veterans who had survived multiple arena matches. They studied Neil with confusion, unable to understand why such a small creature was being sent to fight. Helix 7's main arena held 10,000 spectators. The fighting pit itself was a circular space 50 meters across, surrounded by energy barriers that prevented escape. The floor was stained with blood from countless previous matches. Weapons racks lined the walls, offering various tools of death to fighters who wanted them. Neil was given basic leather armor that protected his torso and limbs, but left plenty of vulnerable areas exposed. The armor was designed for show rather than actual defense, meant to make fights last longer for entertainment value. He was offered weapons but refused them. The Draval used blades and clubs that were sized for their massive frames. In Neil's hands, they would be clumsy and slow. His opponent entered from the opposite gate. The Draval warrior was named Krull, an arena veteran with 15 confirmed kills. He stood 9.5 feet tall, his body covered in thick armor plates that had been augmented with metal studs. 4 arms gave him attacking options that most opponents could not counter. His record showed a preference for crushing smaller aliens with overwhelming strength. The crowd roared as Krull raised all 4 arms in salute. Then they saw Neil, and the roaring turned to laughter. Betting screens showed odds of 200 to 1 against the human survival. Lady Orva sat in a private box, her face expressionless as she placed her bet. Gresh's voice boomed through the arena speakers. Today we have an unusual match. A human, a species newly discovered, will face veteran fighter Krull. Let us see if this soft creature has any true warrior spirit, or if it will die as quickly as it looks. The starting bell rang. Krull charged immediately, all 4 arms reaching out to grab and tear. Neil waited until the last possible moment, then dropped and rolled to the side. Krull's momentum carried him past, and Neil was already moving to attack the exposed back of the warrior's knee. The first strike barely dented Krull's armor. The second strike hit the same spot with more force. The third strike, delivered as Krull spun around, found the gap between armor plates. The Draval roared in pain and swung 2 arms in a wide arc. Neil ducked under the swing and drove his fist into Krull's lower ribs, targeting the organs he knew existed beneath. The crowd's laughter died. This was not the quick execution they had expected. The human was actually fighting back, and worse, seemed to know exactly where to hit. Krull abandoned his attempt to grab Neil and instead started throwing heavy punches. Each swing could have pulverized the human's skull, but only if they connected. Neil stayed mobile, circling constantly, never letting Krull set his feet properly. When the warrior's breathing became labored, Neil attacked the legs again. When Krull protected his legs, Neil went for the eyes. Every movement was calculated, every strike aimed at accumulating damage rather than seeking a single decisive blow. 10 minutes into the fight, Krull was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His movements had slowed, his breathing ragged. Neil was also hurt, his ribs bruised from a glancing blow and his shoulder dislocated from being thrown against the barrier. But he kept moving, kept striking, kept pushing. 15 minutes in, Krull made a mistake. He overextended with an all-out attack, leaving his throat exposed between armor plates. Neil saw the opening and took it. He jumped, wrapped his legs around the warrior's waist for leverage, and locked his arm around Krull's throat in a chokehold. The Draval thrashed and tried to throw him off, but Neil held on with every ounce of strength he possessed. Krull's thrashing weakened. His 4 arms flailed uselessly, unable to reach the human clinging to his back. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the veteran warrior slowly collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his face. Neil maintained the chokehold until Krull stopped moving entirely, then released and rolled away. The arena was silent. Gresh stood in his booth, staring at the unconscious Draval champion and the small human standing over him. Lady Orva's mouth hung open in shock. The betting masters were frantically recalculating their systems. Neil looked up at the crowd and spoke loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Anyone else want to laugh at the tiny human?" Nobody laughed. Medical drones pulled Krull from the arena floor while attendants rushed to check Neil's injuries. His shoulder was the worst problem, the joint completely separated. A medical technician, a conquered species working under Draval supervision, popped the shoulder back into place with practiced efficiency. The pain was extraordinary, but Neil barely flinched, his body flooded with adrenaline and endorphins. They gave him 10 minutes to recover before Gresh's voice returned to the speakers. The human survives its first match, remarkable. But perhaps it was luck. Perhaps Krull was simply having a poor day. Let us test this creature properly. The gates opened again, and 2 fighters entered simultaneously. Both were Draval, both were veterans, and both looked furious at being paired together against a single small opponent. The crowd's confusion shifted to excitement. This was unprecedented. Arena matches followed strict rules about fair combat. But apparently those rules did not apply when the opponent was not Draval. Neil watched his opponent circle in opposite directions, trying to flank him. His shoulders screamed with every movement, but he forced himself to stay mobile. 2 against 1 changed every calculation. He could not afford to engage either fighter directly, because the other would attack from behind. His only advantage was that the 2 Draval had never trained together and might interfere with each other's attacks. The first warrior lunged. Neil dodged, and the second warrior swung a massive fist exactly where Neil had been standing. The fist hit the first warrior instead, sending him stumbling. Neil used the confusion to strike at the second warrior's knee, then rolled away before either could grab him. For 6 brutal minutes, Neil stayed ahead of the coordinated attacks. He used the fighters against each other whenever possible, forcing them to pull punches or risk hitting their partner. When one warrior slipped on blood from an earlier match, Neil exploited the opening with vicious strikes to the fallen fighter's face. The other warrior roared and charged, giving Neil just enough time to grab a weapon from the fallen opponent. The blade was a Draval design, too large for human hands, but Neil used it like a spear. When the charging warrior came within range, Neil drove the blade upward into the gap beneath the warrior's chin. The point punctured through the roof of the mouth and into the brain. The warrior died instantly, his momentum carrying him forward to crash at Neil's feet. The remaining fighter, seeing his partner dead, hesitated. That moment of doubt cost him everything. Neil pulled the blade free and threw it with all his remaining strength. The weapon tumbled through the air and embedded itself in the warrior's eye. He fell backward, screaming and clawing at his face. Medical teams rushed in to extract the injured fighter. Neil stood in the center of the arena, covered in blood that was mostly not his own. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were not even cheering. They simply stared in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Gresh let 30 minutes pass before calling the next match. Neil used the time to breathe and drink water and assess his rapidly accumulating injuries. Everything hurt. His body was running on adrenaline and muscle memory from years of combat training. He knew he could not maintain this pace much longer, but he also knew that showing weakness now would invite even worse opponents. The third match brought a different kind of challenge. The opponent was not Draval, but a massive insectoid creature from a warrior species that the Draval had conquered generations ago. It had 4 legs, 2 primary arms ending in blade-like appendages, and armored chitin covering its entire body. Its species had evolved for combat, and it had survived 23 arena matches. This creature was fast, much faster than the Draval. It skittered across the arena floor with terrifying speed, its blade arms whistling through the air where Neil's head had been moments before. Neil could not match its speed, so he changed tactics. He grabbed handfuls of the bloody sand covering the arena floor and threw it at the creature's compound eyes. The insectoid recoiled, momentarily blinded, and Neil went for its legs. Insectoid joints bent differently than Draval joints. Neil adapted his attacks on the fly, kicking at the leg segments until he found which angles caused damage. When one leg buckled, the creature's balance failed. Neil pressed the advantage, staying under the creature's body where its blade arms could not reach. He found a gap in the armored underside and drove his fingers into it, ripping out chunks of soft flesh. The creature's death screams sounded like metal scraping on metal. When it finally collapsed, green blood pooled across the arena floor. Neil stood up slowly, his entire body shaking with exhaustion. 4 opponents defeated. The betting screens showed odds dropping rapidly as gamblers reassessed their assumptions about human combat capability. Lady Orva watched from her private box, no longer looking embarrassed. She had bet heavily against Neil's survival in the first match and lost a fortune, but she had learned from that mistake. Now she was betting on the human, and the odds were still good enough to recover her losses and more. The 4th match came immediately, giving Neil no time to recover. Gresh's voice carried notes of genuine interest now. The human endures. Most impressive. But endurance means nothing without the will to continue. Let us see how deep that will runs. They sent 3 fighters this time, 2 Draval and 1 armored reptilian species that moved on 6 legs. The crowd was fully invested now, cheering and shouting and placing bets with frantic energy. What had started as a joke had become the most exciting event the arena had seen in years. Neil knew he was running on fumes. His body was shutting down, his reaction slowing. But he also knew that showing fear would ensure his death. He had to project confidence even as his vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss. He faced the 3 fighters and forced himself to smile. The battle was chaos. Neil used every dirty trick he had ever learned. He threw sand and blood in eyes. He kicked groins and bit exposed flesh. When a Draval grabbed his arm, Neil dislocated his own thumb to slip free of the grip. When the reptilian creature tried to gore him with its horns, Neil grabbed the horns and twisted, using leverage to snap the creature's neck. He killed 1 fighter and crippled another before the 3rd warrior, a Draval, managed to land a solid hit. The punch lifted Neil off his feet and sent him crashing into the energy barrier. Something inside his chest broke with an audible crack. He tasted blood in his mouth and knew his lung had collapsed. The Draval warrior approached for the finishing blow, confident the human was done. Neil waited until the warrior was close enough, then grabbed a discarded weapon from the ground and swung it upward between the warrior's legs. The Draval's armor protected most of his body, but evolution had made certain areas vulnerable on every species. The warrior collapsed, screaming in a pitch that sounded almost human. Neil dropped the weapon and fell to his knees. Medical drones swarmed around him, scanning his injuries. The arena medic, a conquered species who had learned to hate the Draval, leaned close and whispered in standard language. "You are dying. Your lung is collapsed. Your organs are bleeding internally. I can stabilize you, but if they send more fighters, you will not survive." Neil coughed blood and nodded. "Stabilize me, and tell Gresh I will fight 10 more if he wants. Tell him the tiny human is not done yet." The medic's eyes widened. "You are insane, probably," Neil agreed. "But I need them to believe I am unstoppable." "Fear is a weapon too." The medic worked quickly, injecting chemical stabilizers and sealing the worst wounds. The treatment was temporary, a patch job that would hold for maybe an hour, but it was enough. When Neil stood up again, the crowd erupted in applause. They had never seen anything like this. A creature that by all logic should be dead, refusing to stay down. Gresh's voice returned to the speakers, and this time it carried something close to respect. "The human has defeated 7 opponents, an unprecedented achievement for any non-Draval fighter. I believe we have seen enough for today." He paused, then added, "The human will return tomorrow to face our champion fighters. Let us see if this impossible survival continues." They carried Neil back to a medical facility beneath the arena. The doctors there were better equipped than the arena medics, and they looked at his injuries with professional concern. A surgeon, herself a conquered species, examined his x-rays and shook her head. "You have 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a fractured jaw, torn muscles in both legs, and internal bleeding in at least 4 places," she said. "How are you still conscious?" "Practice," Neil said through gritted teeth. "How long until I can fight again?" "Fight?" The surgeon looked at him like he was crazy. "You need weeks of recovery, maybe months. If you enter that arena tomorrow, you will die." Neil closed his eyes and thought about Pip and the other prisoners. He thought about every conquered species serving the Draval in chains. He thought about Earth, so far away, and whether anyone there even knew his species had been discovered by hostile aliens. Then he thought about the fear he had seen in the eyes of his opponents in those final moments before they fell. "Then I'll make tomorrow count," he said. "Patch me up as best you can." News of the humans' victories spread through Helix 7 like fire through dry grass. By the next morning, every screen on the station showed replays of Neil's matches. Analysts debated his techniques. Gamblers argued about odds. The conquered species whispered among themselves in their cages and workstations, daring to feel something they had not felt in years. Hope. General Vorn arrived on the station 12 hours before the scheduled match. He was the supreme military commander of the Draval forces in this sector, a warrior who had personally conquered 14 worlds. His body was covered in scars from 1,000 battles, and his reputation was built on never accepting defeat. When he heard that a human had defeated 7 Draval fighters, he took it as a personal insult to his entire species. Neil woke in the medical facility to find Pip sitting beside his bed. Somehow the small alien had convinced the guards to allow a brief visit. Pip's large eyes were wet with tears and his hands trembled as he held a small data pad. "The prisoners are talking about you," Pip said softly. "Even species who have given up hope are watching what you do. But Neil, they are sending General Vorn against you. He is not a simple arena fighter. He is death itself." Neil sat up slowly, wincing at the pain. The doctors had done what they could, but his body was a map of injuries barely held together by medical technology and chemical stimulants. "Tell me about him." Pip activated the datapad showing footage of Vorn's battles. Unlike the arena fighters who relied on raw strength, Vorn used strategy and tactics. He adapted to his opponents. He exploited weaknesses. He had killed competitors from 40 different species, some of them far larger and stronger than humans. He enhanced himself for this fight. Pip continued. Combat stimulants that increase speed and strength. Ceremonial weapons forged from metals that can cut through almost anything. The Dravel High Command wants to erase the embarrassment you caused. They want to prove that humans are not threats, just lucky animals. Neil watched the footage carefully. Vorn was different from the other fighters. He moved with precision, not just power. He thought several moves ahead. This would not be a battle Neil could win through endurance or dirty tricks. "This required something more. What happens to you and the other prisoners if I lose?" Neil asked. Pip's ears drooped. "Nothing changes. We remain property. But if you win..." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some of us have been planning. The guards are fewer during arena events. Security systems are focused on the fighting pit. If the impossible happened and you actually defeated Vorn, it might create enough chaos for us to attempt an escape." "That's suicide," Neil said. "Even if you got out of your cages, where would you go? This station is surrounded by Dravel warships. We would die free," Pip said simply. "That is more than we have now." The weight of that statement settled over Neil like a heavy blanket. He had been fighting for his own survival, his own freedom, but his actions had sparked something larger. Prisoners across the station were watching. Conquered species throughout the Dravel Empire were seeing footage of a human refusing to submit. Whether he wanted it or not, Neil had become a symbol. "Tell them to wait," Neil said. "Tell them not to move until they see what happens in the arena. If I lose, dying in a failed escape helps nobody. If I win, maybe we can coordinate something better than a desperate rush to nowhere." Pip nodded and left, sneaking back through corridors before guards noticed his absence. Neil spent the remaining hours preparing mentally. His body was as ready as it would ever be. The chemical cocktails the doctors had given him would mask pain and boost performance for maybe 20 minutes. After that, his body would crash hard. He would have one chance against Vorn. One opportunity to do something no conquered species had ever done. The arena was packed beyond capacity. Draval from across the sector had traveled to witness this match. The betting pools had reached record amounts. Some bet on Vorn to restore Dravel honor. Others, driven by greed and curiosity, bet on the human who had defied all predictions. Lady Orva sat in her box with a cold expression, having placed every credit she owned on Neil's victory. Neil entered the arena to a mixture of cheers and hostile jeers. They had given him proper armor this time, fitted to his frame rather than the decorative pieces from earlier matches. He carried no weapons. Vorn entered from the opposite gate to thunderous applause. The general stood 10 feet tall, his armor gleaming with ceremonial decorations. He carried twin blades designed to gut opponents with single strikes. Gresh's voice boomed through the speakers. "Today we witness history. General Vorn, supreme commander and champion of our people, faces the human who has shocked our empire. This match will prove once and for all whether the human's victories were skill or mere fortune." Vorn raised his blades and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I will make this quick, human. You have fought bravely for an inferior species. I will grant you the honor of a clean death." Neil rolled his shoulders, testing his mobility. "Respectfully, General, I've heard that before. 7 times, actually. Still here." The crowd murmured at the casual disrespect. Vorn's expression darkened. The others were careless. "I am not." The starting bell rang. Vorn did not charge blindly like the earlier opponents. He advanced carefully, blades held in defensive positions, watching Neil's movements. Neil circled, looking for openings that did not exist. Vorn's technique was flawless, his stance perfect. They exchanged probing attacks for 2 minutes, neither landing significant hits. Neil realized quickly that he could not fight this opponent the same way he had fought the others. Vorn was too skilled, too careful. Every time Neil tried to exploit a gap, Vorn was already covering it. The general's enhanced speed meant Neil's usual mobility advantage was neutralized. Vorn struck suddenly, his blade whistling toward Neil's throat. Neil blocked with his armored forearm and felt the impact rattle his bones. The second blade came from below, aiming for his stomach. Neil twisted aside, but not fast enough. The blade scored a deep cut across his ribs. Blood flowed freely, soaking his armor. "First blood to me," Vorn said calmly. "You are skilled human, but skill means nothing against superior training and superior genetics." Neil's breathing was already labored. The chemical stimulants were burning through his system faster than expected. He had maybe 10 minutes before his body shut down completely. He needed to change the dynamic of this fight, needed to make Vorn react instead of control. Neil charged straight at Vorn, abandoning all defensive strategy. The general's eyes widened slightly at the reckless attack. He brought both blades up to cut the human down, but Neil dropped and slid across the bloody arena floor, passing between Vorn's legs. He grabbed one of the general's ankles and yanked with all his strength. Vorn's enhanced speed meant nothing if his balance was compromised. He fell backward and Neil was already moving. He kicked one of Vorn's blades away and grabbed the other, using it to stab at the gaps in the general's armor. Vorn blocked with his armored forearms and threw Neil off with raw strength. They both stood, breathing hard. Neil had the blade now. Vorn's expression had shifted from confidence to careful assessment. The human was not fighting like a desperate animal. He was fighting like a soldier, like someone who understood that battles were won through adaptation rather than superior power. The fight intensified. Neil used Vorn's own blade against him, compensating for his smaller size with speed and unpredictable angles of attack. Vorn used his enhanced strength to deflect blows and land devastating counterstrikes. 5 minutes in, both were bleeding from multiple wounds. The crowd was silent, watching two warriors push themselves beyond their limits. 8 minutes in, Neil felt his body beginning to fail. His vision blurred. His muscles screamed in protest. The chemical stimulants were depleted. He had maybe 60 seconds left before he collapsed. Vorn seemed to sense this, pressing his advantage with renewed aggression. Neil made a choice. He threw the blade at Vorn's face, not trying to kill but to distract. While Vorn deflected the thrown weapon, Neil charged one final time. He ducked under Vorn's counterattack and drove his helmet directly into the general's throat. The impact crushed Vorn's windpipe. Both fighters fell to the ground. Vorn gasped for air that would not come, his hands clutching at his damaged throat. His enhanced body fought to repair the injury, but the damage was too severe. Neil lay on his back beside the dying general, unable to move, barely conscious. Medical drones rushed into the arena. They worked on Vorn first, trying desperately to save the general's life, but some injuries could not be healed fast enough. Vorn died on the arena floor, his eyes locked on the human who had somehow impossibly defeated him. The arena erupted into chaos. Some Dravel screamed in rage. Others sat in stunned silence. The conquered species and the work crews looked at each other with dawning realization. The impossible had happened. A human had killed General Vorn. Nothing would be the same after this. The medical team pulled Neil from the arena floor and rushed him to emergency treatment. His vital signs were failing across the board. The doctors worked frantically, pumping blood replacement fluids and stabilizing organs that were shutting down. For 6 hours, Neil floated between life and death while the station descended into chaos around him. Pip's whispered network of prisoners moved the moment Vorn's death was confirmed. They had spent years watching guard patterns, memorizing security protocols, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. The chaos following the impossible fight gave them that opportunity. 300 prisoners across 12 holding areas broke free simultaneously. The uprising was not organized or well planned. It was desperation given form. Prisoners overwhelmed guards, seized weapons, and fought their way toward the station's docking bays. Some sought escape ships. Others just wanted to hurt the Draval who had tortured them. The station's security forces responded with lethal force, turning corridors into war zones. Pip led a small group toward the medical facility where Neil was being treated. The group consisted of 7 different species, all of them former captives from Lady Orva's collection. They moved through service tunnels and maintenance shafts, avoiding the main fighting. When they reached the medical facility, they found it guarded by a dozen Draval soldiers. "We cannot fight them," a large reptilian prisoner said. "We are workers, not warriors." Pip looked at his companion, seeing fear but also determination. Neil fought for us when he could have just died quietly. We fight for him now. If we die trying. The battle was brief and brutal. The prisoners had improvised weapons and desperation. The guards had training and superior equipment. But the prisoners had watched Neil's matches, had seen how a weaker opponent could win through creativity and refusal to surrender. They used those lessons. 3 prisoners died, but the guards fell. They found Neil unconscious in a medical pod, his body wrapped in monitoring equipment. The surgeon who had treated him earlier stood nearby, guarding her patient despite having no weapons. She looked at Pip and the bloodied prisoners and made a decision. "Take him," she said, "but he cannot travel far. His body is barely functional. Moving him might kill him. Staying here will definitely kill him," Pip replied. "The Draval will never forgive what he did. They will execute him publicly to restore their honor." They disconnected Neil from the medical equipment and loaded him onto a transport gurney. The surgeon provided portable life support and enough medical supplies for several days. As they moved through the corridors, they picked up more freed prisoners. The group swelled to 50, then 100, then more. Word spread that the human warrior was being evacuated, and others flocked to help protect him. The Draval garrison had regrouped and was systematically crushing resistance throughout the station. But the uprising had achieved one critical objective. In the chaos, several groups of prisoners reached the docking bays and seized ships. Most were small transport vessels or cargo haulers, but a few groups managed to capture Draval military craft. Pip's group reached Docking Bay 7, where a damaged cargo ship was still operational. The pilot, a bird-like species with 4 arms, had been a traitor before the Draval captured his vessel. He knew how to fly, and more importantly, he knew routes through the sector that avoided Draval patrol zones. They loaded Neil and the other wounded onto the ship. More prisoners streamed into the bay, seeking escape. The ship's capacity was 50. Over 200 crammed inside, choosing crowded survival over certain death. The pilot fired up the engines as Draval security forces breached the bay's main entrance. The cargo ship launched under heavy fire. Its shields failed within seconds. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into space, but the pilot was skilled and desperate. He threaded the ship through the station's defensive grid, taking damage but surviving. Behind them, other escaped vessels fled in different directions, scattering across the sector. The Draval sent pursuit ships immediately, but the chaos on the station delayed their response. Several escaped vessels were destroyed in the first hour. Others managed to reach jump points and vanish into faster-than-light travel. Pip's ship limped toward the edge of the system, its engines barely functional, its hull held together by emergency patches. Neil regained consciousness 3 days later. He found himself in the cargo hold of a ship he did not recognize, surrounded by aliens he had seen in Orva's collection. Pip sat beside him, the small alien's ears drooping with exhaustion. "You live," Pip said softly. "The doctors said you had a 30% chance. I think they underestimated human stubbornness." Neil tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every part of his body screamed in protest. "Where are we?" "Running," Pip said simply. 243 of us escaped Helix 7. Others scattered across the sector. The Draval are hunting us, but their empire is large and we are small targets." He paused. "You started something, Neil. Footage of your fights has spread through underground networks. Conquered species across Draval space are watching. Some are starting to resist. How many died in the uprising?" Neil asked. Pip's expression darkened. "Over 1,000. The Draval crushed most resistance within hours. But some of us got away. That is more than anyone thought possible." Neil closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those deaths. He had just wanted to survive, to refuse to be a pet. He had not intended to start a rebellion, but intentions meant nothing compared to consequences. 1,000 dead, and who knew how many more would die in the violence his actions had inspired. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Do not be," Pip said firmly. "Those who died chose to fight rather than live as slaves. You gave them that choice. Before you, we had accepted our fate. Now we have hope." He leaned closer. "But hope is dangerous, Neil. The Draval will not tolerate this. They will hunt us. They will make examples of any conquered species that shows resistance, and they will especially hunt you." The ship's pilot announced over the intercom that they were approaching a hidden asteroid belt where other escaped vessels had agreed to rendezvous. When they arrived, Neil saw 7 ships of various sizes, all damaged, all crowded with refugees. Representatives from different species gathered in the cargo hold to discuss their options. A scaled alien who had been a military strategist before her world fell spoke first. "We cannot outrun the Dravel forever. They have resources we cannot match. We need allies." "What allies?" another prisoner asked. "Every species in this sector has either been conquered or made treaties to avoid conquest. No one will risk Dravel retaliation to help escaped slaves." "The humans," Pip said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. "Neil's species. They are new to the Dravel. They do not know what has happened here. If we can reach human space and warn them, maybe they will help." Neil shook his head weakly. "You do not know humans. We are not unified. My world has dozens of competing nations and corporations. Some might help. Others might try to make deals with the Dravel. And even if they wanted to help, humanity's military is designed for fighting each other, not an interstellar empire." "But they produce warriors like you," the scaled alien said. "If one human can defeat General Vorn, imagine what an army of humans could do." "I got lucky," Neil said. "I exploited Dravel overconfidence. In a real war, their numbers and technology would overwhelm us. Humans are not saviors. We are survivors. There is a difference." The discussion continued for hours. Some refugees wanted to find an uninhabited world and try to build new lives in hiding. Others wanted to continue fighting, striking Dravel outposts and inspiring more uprisings. A few just wanted revenge, regardless of the cost. Finally, they reached a compromise. The refugees would split into multiple groups. Some would seek hiding places in remote systems. Others would work on establishing communication networks to coordinate future resistance. And a small delegation, including Neil, would attempt to reach human space and deliver a warning about the Dravel. It took 3 months to reach the edge of human-explored territory. The ship barely held together, its systems failing one by one. They survived on recycled air and rationed food. Several refugees died from injuries or illness during the journey. But they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant certain capture. When they finally detected human transponder signals, Neil recorded a message to broadcast to any Earth vessel in range. He explained what had happened, warned about the Dravel threat, and requested asylum for the refugees with him. Then they waited, hoping that someone would respond before their ship fell apart completely. An Earth survey vessel found them drifting near the edge of the solar system. The ship's captain was initially skeptical of Neil's story. First contact with hostile aliens seemed too enormous to be true, but the evidence was undeniable. A human, dozens of alien refugees, all telling the same story about an empire that viewed humanity as weak prey. The survey vessel escorted them to Mars Station, where Earth's fragmented governments maintained a neutral meeting place. Neil was debriefed by military intelligence from 7 different nations. They watched footage of his arena fights that had been saved on Pip's datapad. They examined the refugees and confirmed that their technologies and biologies were beyond anything Earth could produce. Within a week, the footage had leaked to public networks across Earth. Humanity watched one of their own face-down alien warriors, twice his size. They saw him refuse to submit, refuse to die, refuse to be anyone's pet. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly agreed on one thing. Humanity would not be prey. But Neil knew the truth that the excited crowds did not understand. He had won through luck and Dravel arrogance. In a real war, humanity was outnumbered and outgunned. The Dravel Empire spanned hundreds of worlds. Earth had barely colonized its own solar system. The fight he had started in that arena would eventually come to humanity's doorstep. And when it did, luck might not be enough. He stood at an observation window on Mars Station, looking at Earth hanging in the distance, and wondered if his survival had actually saved his species or doomed them. Pip stood beside him, the small alien having refused to leave Neil's side. "You think we made a mistake," Pip said. "You think bringing this war to your people was wrong." Neil was quiet for a long moment. "I think war was coming regardless of what I did. The Dravel would have found Earth eventually. Maybe by warning my people I gave them time to prepare. Or maybe I just ensured the fight starts sooner." He turned to Pip. "Either way, we are not prey anymore, none of us. Whatever comes next, at least we face it standing up." Below them, Earth began mobilizing for a war its people barely understood. Training centers opened to teach soldiers the techniques Neil had used in the arena. Engineers studied captured Dravel technology from the refugees. Diplomats reached out to other species who might join a coalition against the Empire. The tiny human pet had become a symbol of resistance across 2 species and counting, but symbols did not win wars. Strategy, sacrifice, and survival did. Neil returned to what he knew best. He joined Earth's military advisory board, teaching others what he had learned about fighting opponents stronger than themselves. The Dravel would come. That was certain. But when they arrived expecting an easy conquest, they would find humans ready to make them pay for every inch of space. The fight in the arena had been personal survival. The fight to come would be about species survival. And humans, Neil knew from bitter experience, were very good at surviving. The war had begun the moment he refused to stay down in that cage. Now all that remained was to see who would still be standing when it ended.